Hello, welcome to What to Expect When You Are Renting, a guide to being a good tenant and neighbor. My name is Liz, and I'll be your facilitator for this class today. As a reminder, do not forget to fill out the Google form entitled What to Expect When You Are Renting questionnaire after watching this video. Let's get started. What to Expect When You Are Renting, a guide to being a good tenant and neighbor. First of all, I am not a lawyer and cannot give legal advice. This class is to provide you with information. All information given in this class is from the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act. The website is listed below. This information given is for Bradley County. If you have further questions, feel free to contact Legal Aid of East Tennessee. Their website is www.laet.org. and their phone number is 423-303-2266. What to expect in this class? We'll go over definitions, rental agreement, being a good tenant, rules and regulations, abandonment, and essential services. Definitions. Tenant. A person entitled under a rental agreement to occupy a dwelling unit to the exclusion of others. Landlord, the owner, leaser, or subleaser of the dwelling unit or the building of which it is a part, and it also means a manager of the premises who fails to disclose as required by 6628-302. Rental agreement. All agreements, written, oral, and valid rules and regulations adopted under 6628-402, embodying the terms and conditions concerning the use and occupancy of a dwelling unit and premises. What should you expect to see on a written rental agreement? A list of tenants, limits of occupancy, duration of lease, rent amount and date owed, right to entry, pet policy, deposits and fees, repairs and maintenance, restrictions on illegal activity, utilities, name of the landlord, and where and how to pay. Tenants' names and occupancy. The lease should indicate how many people are allowed to live in the apartment. You must list the names of the people that will be living in the apartment. Lease duration. According to the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, a written agreement is not required. If the landlord does not sign a written rental agreement, acceptance of rent without reservation by the landlord binds the parties on a month-to-month tenancy. Make sure you have a witness with you when the verbal agreement is made. This is not recommended. It is much better to have documentation of your rental agreement with dates and signatures of both parties. Lease duration. A written lease can be year, month-to-month, bi-weekly, or weekly. A written lease makes documentation easier for you and your landlord. Rent amount and date owed. The lease will indicate how much you owe each month for rent. Please note that the landlord does not have to give a notice for non-payment of rent. According to the Landlord and Tenant Act, the date of rent shall be agreed upon by the parties. You have a 5-day grace period to pay rent unless the 5th day falls on a Sunday or a holiday. Then you have until the next business day to pay before a late fee is applied. Even if rent is paid within the grace period, it can still lead to termination of the lease. If a late fee is applied, it may not exceed 10% of the rent that is past due. For example, if rent owed each month is $500, but $300 was paid, the late fee would only apply to the remaining $200. Right to entry. The tenant shall not unreasonably withhold consent to the landlord who has the right to enter the rental property to perform maintenance, inspection, potential purchasers, etc. The landlord does not need consent from the tenant to enter when there is an emergency. Emergency means a sudden, generally unexpected occurrence or set of circumstances demanding immediate action. The landlord does not need consent when utilities have been turned off to no fault of the landlord's to inspect the dwelling and property for damage and make repairs due to lack of utilities. The landlord may enter without consent if they have a court order. The landlord does not need consent to enter if the tenant has abandoned the dwelling. Abandonment is the tenant's unexplained or extended absence from the premises for 30 days or more without payment of rent as due shall be prima facie evidence of abandonment. The landlord is then expressly authorized to re-enter and take possession of the premises. The landlord does not need consent to enter if the tenant is deceased, incapacitated, or incarcerated. The landlord may show the dwelling to potential buyers only after giving a 24-hour notice within the 30 days of lease termination. The landlord may not abuse the right of entry to harass the tenant. Pet policy. There are no set laws in the Landlord and Tenant Act for pet policies, so this is decided by the landlord. In some dwellings, pets are not permitted. In dwellings where they are permitted, fees are set by the landlord. If you already have a pet, it is best to ask what the pet policy is before moving into a dwelling. Deposits and fees. A deposit is to be paid before you move into the premises. The amount of deposit is set by the landlord. The tenant has the right to inspect the premises before moving in. Set up a time with your landlord to do a walkthrough together. Document damages that are already there with digital pictures if possible. Have a witness with you who can verify these damages. Make a list of damages and have the landlord, yourself, and the witness sign it and make sure everyone gets a copy. If you leave a dwelling with unpaid rent or other amounts due, the landlord may remove the amount from the deposit as long as it was placed into an account that is used only for the deposits. If you leave a dwelling with no rent or other amounts owed, the landlord will send a notification to the last known address or reasonable determinable address. If the landlord has not had a response from the tenant after 60 days, then he or she may keep the amount of the deposit. Request a walkthrough. In the written agreement, the landlord may require tenants to already be vacated. If a walkthrough is scheduled, the tenant must go and agree to sign a list of any damages. If damages are discovered in the dwelling 30 days after the tenant has left, or 7 days after a new tenant has moved in, then the landlord may not be entitled to the payment of damages. Repairs and maintenance. The landlord must comply with acceptable health and safety codes so that the dwelling is in a clean and safe condition. The landlord must make repairs and do what is necessary to keep the dwelling a habitable place. The landlord must make sure common areas are in a clean and safe condition. For dwellings with 4 or more units, the landlord must provide proper receptacles and conveniences for the removal of ash, garbage, rubbish, and other waste. The landlord and tenant may agree in writing that the tenant may perform particular repairs, maintenance tasks, alterations, and remodeling. However, this must be made in good faith and not a reason to avoid the responsibilities of the landlord. The landlord may not treat performance of the separate agreement described in subsection C, the previous slide, as a condition, any obligation, or performance of any rental agreement. Being a good tenant. Being a good tenant means The tenant is required to keep the dwelling up to housing codes that affect health and safety. Dispose of garbage, rubbish, and ashes into the designated receptacles. The tenant shall not destroy, deface, damage, impair, or remove any part of the premises or allow anyone else to do so. The tenant shall not engage in illegal activity on the premises. The tenant shall act in a manner that is courteous to their neighbors. Rules and regulations. Rules and regulations are enforceable when its purpose is to promote the convenience, safety, or welfare of the tenants in the premises, preserve the landlord's property from abusive use, or make a fair distribution of services and facilities held out for the tenants generally. It is reasonably related to the purpose for which it is adopted. It applies to all tenants in the premises. It is sufficiently explicit in its prohibition, direction, or limitation of the tenant's conduct to fairly inform the tenant of what the tenant must or must not do to comply. It is not for the purpose of evading the obligations of the landlord. The tenant has notice of it at the time the tenant enters into the rental agreement. A rule or regulation adopted after the tenant enters into the rental agreement is enforceable against the tenant if reasonable notice of its adoption is given to the tenant and it does not work a substantial modification of the rental agreement. Abandonment. The tenant's unexplained or extended absence from the premises for 30 days or more without payment of rent, as shall be prima facie evidence of abandonment. The landlord is then expressly authorized to re-enter and take possession of the premises. If the tenant has not paid rent 15 days past rent is due and has either removed personal effects or has discontinued utility services for the dwelling, etc. If it has been 15 days, the landlord must post a notice on the premises and send a notice to the tenant. If the tenant does not contact the landlord 10 days after the notice is posted and mailed, then the landlord can take possessions out of the dwelling. If the tenant does contact the landlord within 10 days that the property is not abandoned after the notice is posted, then the landlord will be required to go through judicial process to claim items and end the tenancy. If the landlord does take possession of the tenant's items, they must hold on to them for 30 days, giving the tenant the opportunity to collect said possessions. If the tenant does not, the landlord may sell the possessions and use the money to pay back rent, damages, etc. The notice must state why the landlord believes you have left, that they intend to re-enter and take possession of the premises, including the removal of personal effects, and a way for the landlord to be contacted. Essential services. Essential services means utility services, including gas, heat, electricity, and any other obligations imposed upon the landlord which materially affect the health and safety of the tenant. If the landlord fails to provide essential services, the tenant must give the landlord a written note specifying what need is not being met and that the tenant did not cause any essential services to not be met. The tenant must give notice first, then they may also do one of the following. Obtain essential services while the landlord is not providing them, and deduct actual and reasonable costs from the rent. Recover any damages that may have been done due to the lack of essential services. However, the tenant must sue the landlord for damages and rental value. Find a reasonable substitute housing until the issue is resolved. In this case, the tenant is excused from paying rent. However, the tenant must sue the landlord for the cost. Before acting according to your rights as stated previously, you must give written notice to your landlord specifying the breach was not caused by the tenant or member of the tenant's family intentionally or unintentionally. Request for repairs. You may request for the landlord to repair non-essentials. For example, the stove is no longer working. This must be a written notice. The tenant may recover damages, obtain injunctive relief, and recover reasonable attorney's fees for any non-compliance by the landlord with the rental agreement upon giving 14 days written notice. If the rental agreement is terminated for non-compliance after sufficient notice, the landlord shall return all prepaid rent and security deposits. Again, I am not a lawyer and I cannot give legal advice. This class is to provide you with information. All information given in this class is from the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, which the website is listed below. This information is given for Bradley County. If you have further questions, please feel free to contact Legal Aid of East Tennessee. Their website is www.laet.org, and their phone number is 423-303-2266. Thank you so much for taking class today. Again, do not forget to fill out the Google form entitled What to Expect When You Are Renting questionnaire. Have a great day.